All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Simon Davies. It's April 9th, 2025, and we're via Zoom. Simon's joining us from the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us today, Simon.
Pleasure.
And the first question to get things started is why wine?
Yeah, very good question. I should say that this being interviewed about what I do and my history is not something I'm used to doing or something I've prepared for. But I did bone up a little bit. I had a look at the interview you did with my friend John Thomas, and I saw that his backdrop of his beautiful vineyard down there at the foot of the Dundee Hills was a little bit more glamorous than my wine rack behind me. But yeah, hopefully your viewers and listeners will forgive that. Why wine? Yes, a good question. I mean, it's something that came along entirely accidentally for me. I grew up in a place which probably for your listeners on the west coast of America won't be immediately familiar, but I grew up in a place called Cornwall, and Cornwall is in the very far southwest of the United Kingdom. It's a place that is culturally very distinct from the rest of England. So it's a county in England, but it's very different culturally. It's very different historically. It had its own language, and we Cornishmen think of ourselves as a band apart. We're part of the sort of the fringe of Britons that were pushed west by the Romans. So you get people like us in Cornwall and the Welsh in Wales and the Cumbrians up in the northwest and the Scots, of course, and of course the Bretons in Wales, in France, sorry. So in lots of ways, you know, the place I grew up had a lot more in common with the north of France, with Brittany in France, than really with a lot of the United Kingdom. And when you grow up in a place like that, it does feel quite it feels quite other. You know, when you come to the rest of England, England feels like a very distinct place. When you cross the border from Cornwall into Devon and then, you know, up through places like Bristol and, you know, into London, where I've lived for the last 30 years. Yeah, Cornwall's a very different place, and it's a very long way from anywhere. You know, if I was to get in my car now and drive to Cornwall, it would take me 6-7 hours, something like that. So it's a big old drive, especially in an island as small as ours. To drive 7 hours to get anywhere is a very long way indeed. The community there is pretty much staunchly working class. It's a place of declined old industry, mining, engineering, that sort of stuff. My father was an engineer who worked in a factory in our local town. He was a skilled engineer, so an apprenticed man, you know, a man with a skill who left school at 16 and worked all his life in a tool making factory. And that's what you did in that town. In 1985, I think it was, that the industry sort of went bust. The mining industry in Cornwall had always had a lot of ups and downs. There were peaks where the price of tin, which is principally what was mined there, would be very high, and the community would make a lot of money. And then there would be huge lows. I mean, the 1840s are a good example. If you ever see anyone on the west coast of America with a name that starts with tree or pole or pen, they're probably Cornishmen that left Cornwall in the 1840s because there was no work. So there's always been these ups and downs. The last down, which started in the 1980s, has been going on ever since. And people like me who were you know, culturally, socioeconomically working class, but you know, wanted to explore the rest of the world, most of us left. You know, and we went to places like London, which is where I went to university. Yeah, it was in London actually that I met my future wife Inka, who I met in the late 90s, and she had a job while she was at university working at a wine shop called Oddbins, and Oddbins was one of the great sort of fermentation places for the London wine trade. You know, it was the sort of place that was easy to access. You got a lot of instant knowledge in wine. It was a really cool place. So she had a Saturday job there while she was at university. I was studying chemistry, so not a totally unrelated subject to wine, but I had absolutely no interest in wine at all. I assumed I would go on and be a a scientist or something, you know, sort of science adjacent. You know, not that I was a very good scientist, I should point out. I was a pretty terrible chemist, but you know, you're in it and you're doing it. Anyway, so when I finished my degree, I got a sort of part-time job working over the summer while I was working out what to do with my life as a van driver's mate. So I wasn't even at the level of van driver. I think that must be the lowest rank in the UK wine trade. You don't even get to drive the van. You just get to sit next to the van driver and lift all the boxes and all the crates and everything. So that's what I did over the summer. And one day in the shop, they needed some help, you know, on the retail side. And so I came in one Saturday, and the beauty of the shop, well, there were two beauties of the shop really. One of the beauties of the shop was that it was made under these beautiful old railway arches in the centre of London. So these beautiful old deep brick built railway arches, and it went back a really long way. So it's a perfect place to store wine was the first thing. And because it was such a perfect place, Oddbins, which was this company I was working for, had deemed it to be a site worthy of having a fine wine section. So it had its own sort of shop within a shop that had fine wine. I didn't know anything about any of this stuff, but I knew that there was a fine wine section. And this Saturday evening, I'd just come into the end of my shift, and I was standing at the till. I think I would have been how old at the time? Maybe 20, something like that. And I was standing at the till, and I could smell something in the room, and I didn't know what it was. And I said to Colin, Colin Wills was the guy's name. I said to him, Colin, what's that smell? And he said, oh, I've put a glass of wine there down for you. And so I've got one here. So I did what I thought you meant to do, and I put my nose in the glass of wine. And it was like what do they say? It's a Damascene moment. It was an epiphanal moment. And it was like, wow, this is terrific. What's this? And it was a wine from the Rhone Valley, from Côte Rôtie. So it was a Syrah made by a man called Christophe Bonnefond, and it came from a vineyard called Les Rochans. And I still remember it to this day. And it was a sort of light bulb moment for me. And I thought, wow, okay, that's what this thing is. That's what this thing is all about, you know. So I temporarily, or well, as it turns out, permanently gave up on being any sort of scientist, and I quit my lucrative position as a van driver's mate and got a job working within the shop. And I mean, it was fantastic. It was such a, it was an incubator for wine and wine knowledge and the industry. It was such a fantastic place. I can still remember the first day we had a big delivery come into the shop, and my job was to put it away on all the shelves. And I remember standing looking at these boxes and these names that I had no idea what any of them were, and thinking, well, where do they go? Why does Puy Fuissé go over there in Burgundy, and why does Puy Fumé go over there in Loire? And what's Margaux and what's Pauillac, and what are these things? Never mind Burgundy. Why does what's the difference between a Gevrey Chambertin and a Chambolle Musigny or whatever? This was like, but the wines need to get put on the shelf, so you learn it, right? You learn where these things are and you learn where things go. Yeah, so I did that for a little while, and then I got a promotion, and I was allowed to be an assistant manager of a shop, which gave me a little bit more scope. And so I was moved from where I was on Farringdon Street, just a little bit further north in London, to Islington, and I stayed there. I'm going to say maybe a year, something like that. Probably a year. And then I got another promotion, and I was allowed to run my own shop, which was a very cool thing. So I ran a shop for Oddbins it was for 2 Christmases. It probably wasn't quite for 2 years, but I ran it, let's say 18 months, 2 years, something like that. And again, that was fantastic. I got to do my own thing, arrange tastings. I mean, you just learn so much just being in front of bottles of wine all the time, and talking to customers. When customers come in and say, can you recommend something? Being able to slowly, build your wine knowledge and be able to do that was just fantastic, and I loved that very much. I still harbor a sort of slight wish to run a wine shop one day. I mean, I just think it's a really cool thing. I think being around the bottles and and making the selections and putting stuff on the shelf is a really cool thing. Unfortunately, I was at my till one Saturday evening, and these two guys came in wearing balaclavas and brandishing guns and held the place up. And I decided at that point that I probably wasn't prepared to die for odd bins, and so I started looking for other jobs, and that was sort of my first job, and that was my first move.
That's a pretty incredible way to start. I'm curious. I'm curious in that part. You mentioned obviously learning a lot and having to learn a lot. What did you find was sort of your biggest educational? What was the biggest way you were learning things, and what excited you? What made you want to keep learning about wine?
Yeah, I mean, I remember. I mean, unlike a lot of my comrades in the London wine trade, I don't really have any sort of formal qualifications or anything like that. So I've never done things like the diploma or the MW or anything like that. But I did that. There's a thing called the WSET, Wine and Spirit Education Trust, I think, and I did level one. That's about as qualified as I am in wine. And I remember going to, so Oddbins actually ran the courses, and I remember going to the first, probably the only, day of the course, whatever it was. And the woman whose name I forget, but she was a very good teacher, and she gave us a very diverse selection of wines to taste. And I remember one of them being a Tokay Pinot Gris from Domaine Choffet in Alsace. And I remember sort of being blown away a little bit by how diverse wine can be. I mean, I think that was the first thing that I learned at Oddbins. Oddbins had a fantastic selection of wines, really, certainly for what this was, which would have been, I guess, 1999, year 2000, I think. Um, yeah, and just the diversity, the fact, going back to those two names that sound similar, the fact that a Pouilly Fuisse and a Pouilly Fumé taste so completely different. I mean, clearly we know one's a Chardonnay, one's a Sauvignon, but for somebody who knew nothing about wine, these diversities of flavor, um, yeah, were really, really inspiring. And I remember the other thing that they had in the shop. They had two things. They had a book written by a guy called Robert Parker, and they had a book written by a guy called Michael Broadbent. I remember sort of reading through both those books almost from cover to cover and being sort of amazed by some of these old wines that Broadbent would taste, wines from 100 years ago, and all the grand wines from places like Romney Conti and Lafite and Mouton and all these things, all these incredible things, and then reading the Parker book, and finding a really sort of really inspiring contemporary, um kind of easy to understand way of presenting wine. I mean, I still think that, I'm sure we'll talk about it later on, but I still think that there's never been another person who's been able to present wine, whether you like the styles of wine that he liked, and whether you like the way the industry reacted to his writing and whatever. But boy, I mean, that guy could taste, and that guy could write, and that guy could present wine in a way that made it so interesting and so relevant. So there were these two books. So Broadbent and Parker. You couldn't really get two people so further apart, and yet I found them both really inspiring in their own way. So that was a really great way to learn about wine. I remember the other thing I had was the French Hachette guide, which I kept in the bathroom, which was sort of sort of toilet reading, which was great, leafing through. I still remember they used to tell you the name of the horse that ploughed the vineyards for Romney Conti, which I thought was terrific. Jasmine, I think. Could be, yeah.
Amazing. So you're coming to the you've been at Oddbins and you're looking for the next thing. Was it going to be wine for sure? Were you hooked enough at that point that you were looking for wine for your next step?
Yeah, I don't think there was any doubt then. I mean, science was really in the rear view mirror. I was kind of two years in by that point, and thought I thought whatever my next move was going to be, it was going to be in wine. I mean, um, Yeah, and so there was a I'm trying to think what the name of the magazine was. We used to get a magazine sent to the to Oddbins every week. Um, it comes back to me. I'll tell you, it's called something like The Grocer or something like that. It was a sort of weekly trade publication, and there was an advert in there for a sort of customer service rep type thing to work for what was then quite a new business called Fine and Rare Wines. And Fine and Rare was a well, I mean, I'll tell you all about them, but I mean, it was a very interesting job, and I went for an interview there with the then managing director, a man called Ian Dacre, and they offered me the job. And so I gave notice to Obbins, and then moved from Islington to West London to Ladbroke Grove, and worked for Fine and Rare for the next 10 years.
So you said it was a pretty new business at the time. As you went in for your interview, what did you understand the business to be, and what did you understand your role to be?
Well, I mean that was one of the beauties of Fine and Rare at the time, which wasn't always beautiful, but it was a kind of chaotic place in lots of ways. It was a business founded by a guy called Mark Bedini, and Mark Bedini was lots and lots of things. He was always very good to me. He could be a difficult um, he could be a difficult guy. He wasn't brilliant with people, but he was a guy that was brilliant with ideas. And he'd come up with this concept of this sort of marketplace in wine, which was miles ahead of its time. It was sort of Amazon before, Amazon had ever been conceived. He was really committed to technology, and he was really committed to the idea of choice within wine. And um, at a time where you basically had one guy who had the voice, had the monopoly on judgment about what was good wine and what was bad wine, and that was Robert Parker. And so if you created a business which was fueled by technology, which took essentially lists from wine suppliers of various types, be they producers, be they merchants, be they brokers, be they negociants, whatever they were across Europe, you took all of these lists and you put them through this piece of technology and broadcast them, and had the prices set to create a market price. You could create this incredible range of wines, and all you would need is just the sort of the endorsement on certain wines by somebody like Robert Parker, and you create this choice and you create this selection. And it was a really cool, really dynamic place to work. I mean, it was terrific. It was a hard place to work because it was quite a hard business to run for them. I think Mark Bedini was a terrific visionary when it came to ideas, when it came to presentation, when it came to technology, but he wasn't a people person, and he couldn't really run the business himself. So he would have these series of managing directors or CEOs or whatever would come through the business and would run the business for him. And they all had varying degrees of success, if I put it that way. And it was complicated because it was a difficult business, because we would be buying wines on behalf of customers who very often wouldn't pay us until the wine arrived with them. So there was often this sort of black hole in the middle. And part of my job when I started was to be on this customer service side, where I would have people shouting at me saying, "Where is my wine?" And I would say, "Well, I know where your wine is, but until we get paid, we can't pay the supplier, and therefore we can't ship your wine." And it was complicated. I mean, it was like it was almost like a sort of punk rock outfit. It was a business that was founded on a fantastic idea, which was difficult to run. It got more, it got much easier to run once the business grew, and once we got several profitable en primeur campaigns under our belt, and things became easier. My job changed dramatically 2005, 2006, and I switched from this sort of um, customer service logistics sort of role into a much more sort of wine focused position. And again, credit to Mark Bedini. I mean, he recognized something in me and said, I really like this guy. I think we can do something with him. And from about 2006 onwards, I sort of took on the all of the kind of offer writing, the sort of front end presentation. So I became the guy that when Finer Air was putting stuff out into the world, it was stuff that I'd written, and that meant that I had to go and find that stuff that was being put out in the world. So I was dealing with agents, intermediaries, merchants, wine producers, you know, all sorts of people all over Europe, and making these selections and then putting these offers out. And we were doing 3 company offers a week. So it was busy. You know, we were really busy, you know, finding these wines, writing them, putting them out. And again, you know, he wasn't an easy man, but you know, Mark Bedini backed me and saw something in me and you know, promoted me to this level. And you know, I made a success of it. You know, it worked well, and the business, you know, the business grew alongside the work that I was doing. And my team went from sort of me to being me plus about 13 people by the time that I eventually left. So it was, you know, we really grew it, and no, it was a fantastic place. And I traveled widely, and I you know, met lots and lots of really interesting people, and it was all thanks to this, you know, this sort of yeah, this sort of trust and belief that Mark put in me, you know, and you know, you meet these guys along the way who, you know, act as mentors, and act as people who you know, give you access to the next level, you know, whatever that means. And Mark was definitely one of those guys. You know, he saw something in me, believed in me, and you know, I don't know that every one of my contemporaries in the wine trade would feel as, you know, kindly towards Mark as I do. Like I said, he was a difficult guy, and he had the capacity to rub people up the wrong way. But he was a good guy to me, and you know, he believed in me and saw something in me and allowed me to flourish. You know, and the amount of, you know, tasting and experience and knowledge I gained over those 10 years was I mean, it was incredible, really. You know, I tasted everything. You know, you know, you name a, and I don't mean that in a horrible, you know, conceited way, but I mean, I was, you know, the access was given to me that I could go and taste these things, you know, very old Bordeaux, old Burgundy, all the, you know, all the great properties, all that sort of stuff. And, you know, there's some of the things that I tasted back in those days, and not only just the things that I tasted, but the circumstances in which I was tasting them. You know, the rooms I was in, the people I was sitting with, you know, sitting at the blending sessions at Chateau Margaux with Paul Pontellier, you know, was an incredible privilege, you know, to sit next to somebody and his team with that kind of experience, and to taste these individual lots from all the different sites that Margaux farms and produces from, which of course no one knows about, right? Because there's no terroir in Bordeaux, right? I mean, Bordeaux, you know, Margaux is a wine that comes from one place, and of course that's not true. There's plenty of terroir. It's just that they take all these parcels and they blend it together, and you know, tasting, you know, sitting in the you know, in the back rooms at Margaux and tasting that. And that's a, you know, that's an example of, you know, lots of the sort of things that I was fortunate enough to do when I worked there. Yeah, it was a real privilege, and a great sort of foundation for what came next.
So you mentioned obviously then the kind of in the middle of your time there, going into a different role. Tell me about when you're in that role, when you're tasting all of these wines, when you're writing and producing so prolifically. What are you looking for? What is the sort of the secret sauce, I guess, for what you want to present to your customers? And how are you finding customers, or how are customers finding you? How are those relationships being built?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. So the back end of that question, the bit about, you know, the relationships and all that sort of stuff. So we had a team of sales people. So my job was partly, although a lot of these salesmen, or salespeople, I should say, acted in a fairly autonomous way. So they would be managing a portfolio of clients. My job really was to act as a kind of funnel, you know, to produce a you know, a compelling offer or argument and send it out to the mailing list, and then for that, hopefully for people to respond to that and say, yes, I want to buy, and those would then go to their individual account managers, and they would then look after the customers. So I was sort of a conduit. I was sort of a funnel. In terms of finding the wines, I mean, it was brilliant, really. I mean, you know, I go back to it again. You know, hats off to the guy. You know, at the time, Parker really moved the market. You know, things are totally different now. You know, the work I do now is almost, you know, completely devoid of any sort of, you know, wine critic endorsements at all. But back then, you know, 15, 20 years ago, it was fantastic. So you would, you know, In fact, I said this to Michael Etzel the other day. Of course, is Parker's brother-in-law, and I said, we had this guy who lived in Baltimore, and so he was on the original Wine Advocate mailing list. So he would get his paper copy of the Wine Advocate before anybody else would, and he would take it apart and fax it to us. And we would, group of us would sort of stand around the fax machine at 6 o'clock in the evening, watching these pages come out. And we'd take marker pens and we would mark these wines that we were like, oh, we can get some of that. I know where I can get that. I know where that is. And we would use this as this sort of, this sort of truth, right? And then we would go out into the market and we'd find these wines and they would, become a way for us to do these offers. It was terrific. That was certainly early days. And then when things like the Wine Advocate and other things to an extent, right? Things like the Wine Spectator and those kind of things, and Jancis Robinson as well. Where they'd made a great critical response to something, we would go out and find it, and that was often the basis of it. So we were, and then as time went on, you would be following those leads, right? So if something had got a great critical response in the previous vintage, this would have been, I don't know, 2005 vintage or 2006 vintage, whatever it was. Next year, when the wine was released, you would then jump on it before there was any critical response at all. And you would remind customers, you say, well, last year it got 98 points or whatever it is. It hasn't yet been rated, so you can get your hands on this thing before it happens. And you would start to build relationships with, particularly directly with producers and with those who were their UK or European importers, that kind of thing. So you would start to build connections that way as well.
Did you find that you were dealing mostly with wine for consumption or with wine for collection?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the name kind of gives it away a bit. So it was fine and rare wine. So it was dealing a lot with Bordeaux, a lot with young Bordeaux, a lot with first and second growth and equivalent. So it was wine aimed a lot at the collector. It was aimed not explicitly, but we certainly didn't not talk about it, if you see what I mean. In the investment angle in wine, right? So there was that involved as well. We didn't push it front and center, but there was always a sort of, you want to buy this because look at where the price is of the previous vintage kind of thing. So there was that aspect to it as well. Certainly, that was more, I would say, on the the guys who were doing the more account management side. I think I was always more focused on the wines themselves, the technique in wine production, the characters behind the wine, that sort of thing. So that was always my calling.
So by that point in your career, you obviously, as you mentioned, you had tasted a lot of wines, you had been exposed to all kinds of things. What did you find yourself being drawn to, I guess, on a personal level, in terms of style, in terms of terroir, in terms of region, and also on a professional level? What did you enjoy, and what did you find was the most sellable wine?
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. I mean, I guess my chemistry background, chemistry is full of systematic naming of things. The nomenclature of chemistry is something which is very precise. And I think the first thing that I was drawn to was Germany, was the Mosel, because I was really drawn to that idea of a single grape essentially producing every single wine of every single fine wine in the Mosel. And yet, these little micro parcels side by side could be so incredibly different. Why does a Brauneberger Juffer taste different from a Brauneberger Juffer Sonnenor? And why does that taste different from a Wählener Sonnenor? And why does that taste different from a Gracker Domprost? And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, they're all basically made the same way. They're all from sort of the same place. They're all the same thing, right? And I think that was the first thing that I found really, really fascinating, that you could get these wines that were so different, so from a flavor point of view, so different, from such a small area. And that immediately, of course, leads you into the rabbit hole of Burgundy. So, Burgundy became this place that was and still is endlessly fascinating. This idea of this 30-mile hillside, which essentially all looks the same, right? If you drive up the RN74 alongside Burgundy, you look at it, basically just all looks the same. It's little villages and a hillside behind. and yet they all taste different. Why does a Gevrey Chambertin not taste like a Chambolle Musigny? And why do the two sides of Chambolle Musigny, the Amaryllis side and the Bon Mar side, why do they taste different? What, you know? And so I found that really, really interesting. So I was definitely drawn in that direction. I mean, from a selling point of view, Bordeaux was king. I mean, Bordeaux was absolutely king, and I spent more time in, around, and tasting Bordeaux than anywhere else. I was going, I don't know, 5 or 6 times a year, maybe. You know, certainly going and tasting the primeurs two, maybe 3 times, and then going out at least once or twice again to meet with either the negociants or meet the people that were making the wines at the chateau. So I mean, Bordeaux was super important for us. And actually, even though it doesn't figure in my professional life now, I'm still a huge fan of the wines of Bordeaux and still drink them, and.
So you mentioned that you were at Fine and Rare for about 10 years. Tell me about the next step. Wow, what caused you to look for the next step, and what were you looking for at that point?
Yeah, I think my interest in the smaller and the more handmade and the more artisanal side of things was growing all the way through my time at Fine and Rare. It sort of became the stuff that I was more interested in. I became more interested in the idea of individual people or families running an estate on their own, guys that really have dirt under their fingernails, people that do it. And Bordeaux is great, but it's a land of tailored jackets and ties and and shiny shoes. I like a tailored jacket. I like a pair of well-polished shoes. I've got no problem with any of that stuff. But with wine, I'm sort of drawn in a slightly different direction. And I like characters that exist in that space where it's an owner or family who are running the show. And I'd started doing business with an agent, an importer who had the most fantastic portfolio of wines that they were importing into the country. A lot of the great and the good of Burgundy. A lot of top producers from Bordeaux as well on the sort of smaller side. They just had the most fantastic reputation. I got on very well with one of the owners there, and I knew that their sales director was leaving to set up his own business, and so I just sort of threw my hat in the ring and I said, look, if he's leaving, how about me, kind of thing. And they said, all right. They said, okay, that sounds great. But there is one small caveat, which is that we're thinking about selling the business. And until that process is resolved, we just need to pause it. The job's yours, but we don't want to give you the runaround. So just give us a few weeks and we'll confirm it all. And they were one of the businesses that they had done a lot of work with was a business called A&B Vintners, which is the business I've worked for the last 13 years. So it wasn't a business I'd heard of. So it is run by a guy called John Arnold, and he had a background working in the city. And when the job that he had been doing in the city changed and became much more sort of screen-based digital operation, he was something like mid-30s and was out of a job but was really into wine, and so he set up this little wine business, which, because John Arnold is very, very good at what he does, had gone on to become a really successful little wine business. And they've been buying a lot of wine. This is A&B Vintners, been buying a lot of wine through this importer that I've been talking to. And the owner of the importer, I think, had mentioned to John that he'd been talking to me and that he found me and that they were planning to hire me and what have you. And one afternoon I was at work and my phone rang and I picked it up and I said hello. And the gruff voice at the end of the phone said, "Hello, you don't know me. I'm John Arnold, but I hear you're quite good." And I said, "Oh, hello, yeah, thank you. That's nice of you." And he offered to buy me dinner, and we went out and we had dinner together and just really hit it off. Really hit it off. I liked him, he liked me. We got on really well from the start. Although I didn't have this sort of city financial background that John had come from, Fine and Rare was a busy business. It was a busy business, and it was a digital business. It was based on numbers and availability and all this sort of stuff. And so while my background wasn't John's background, we sort of had this sort of trading business kind of thing in common. And yeah, and we just really hit it off. And I mean, I forget the timeline exactly. We certainly met another couple of times, had maybe lunch, had dinner, and just he offered me a job. He said, look, I'd love you to join alongside me, and he was very frank from the start. He said, I do Burgundy, I do the Rhone, I do Provence, so you ain't doing that, son. You better go and find your own thing to do. And I said, all right, well, I'll give it a go. And so that was 2012. That would have been this sort of time of year, sort of April 2012, something like that. Um, Beginning of June, we travelled to Burgundy together for the first time, and we tasted the 2011s with Pierre-Yves Colin Moret, which was and is, our most important producer. At the time, he was a pretty small operation, working out of two small underground cellars in Chassagne. I mean, I can still remember the wines, and I was fortunate to drink a 2011 PYCM just a few weeks ago, and they're still brilliant. I mean, in a vintage that is not, I mean, 2011 is just not a famous vintage really for Burgundy. God, he absolutely smashed those wines. I mean, they were brilliant. They were taut, they were linear, they were expressive, they were bright. They were sort of everything you could want, and they still are, by the way, which is again very unusual for a 2011. So I realized I was in the right spot. I'd realized I'd signed on with the right sort of business, and yeah, and we've between us we've developed the business ever since. So I was working alongside John for a couple of years. I think in 2014 he made me a director of the firm, and since then I've sort of grown my little corners of the business. So the first thing I did was take on some producers in Italy. As a business, we're a Burgundy business. That's who we are and what we do. We understand that thing about small producers, parcellated holdings, single vineyard operation, all that sort of stuff. And Piedmont in northern Italy does that too. The wines are single vineyards, they're made by small producers, they're single grape variety, they're all that sort of stuff. So that was the most obvious first step. I went there pretty much when I first started. It would have been 2012, and I tasted the 2008s and 2009s, and sort of slowly built a little portfolio there, which has become a really useful, really essential corner of A&B Vintners as a business. We got some super producers there, from the top of the tree, people like Roberto Verezio, down to new guys who are just starting up, who are got small parcels of land, who are haven't even made their first Barolo yet. And what I learned to do in Piedmont, turning up, knocking on doors, I call it turning over stones, going there and just looking what's underneath, just seeing what's there, is a brilliant process, really. It's hard work, doing that, but it's a really interesting process because you meet a lot of people, you learn a lot about the styles of wines that exist out there. You start being able to make judgments independently from what the critics say. I mean, I think that was my first real departure from, looking at what the critics thought and to thinking, what do I think? What's my style? What do I like? And when I went to Piedmont for the first time, that was, I guess, slowly coming towards the end of that, Barolo Boys, New Oak, extraction, dark wines kind of style. And I understand instinctively that wasn't the sort of Barolo that I was interested in. I was always interested in the lighter, the more delicate, the more ethereal, the more hands-off, the more Pinot Noir style of Barolo. And so I sort of built a portfolio of some wonderful people like Fuerzio, like my dear friends at Fiorenzo Narda and Massimo Benavelli, and all these kind of guys whose wines I love and whose wines I drink, and who now, all these years on, 15 years on nearly, I still love and still work with. So, all that groundwork that I did back then was totally worth it. And those wines still sell very, very well. They're still, loved by our customers, and that we still get, loads and loads of great feedback about how delicious they are.
You raised a really interesting point there when you talked about sort of developing your own critical lens, I guess, and stepping away from the critics. Tell me about that from a sort of a confidence perspective, and then from a turning around and convincing someone else that the wines you've chosen, whether or not they're critically acclaimed, are worthwhile.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's two points to that. You talk about, well, not you talk about, I talk about, that idea of the mentor, the way that Mark Bedini was with me at Fine and Round. John has done the same. So John's a bit older than me. He's, I think, 14 years older than me. And he he sort of said to me right from the start, yeah, you're not doing what I'm doing, because I'm doing that. I'm doing Burgundy, so you can clear off out of there. And you're not doing the Rhone, because I'm doing the Rhone, so you can clear off out of there. Although you can come with me and help me write the offers, because that makes life easier for me. um, but he said to me from the start, you can buy what you want. I back you. I trust you. I back you. I trust your palate. I trust your judgment. You can buy what you want, but you better sell it. And there is no greater motivation for doing something well than knowing that you cock it up, you're in trouble, right? We're a trading business. We don't want to sit on gallons and gallons or vintages and vintages of stock. You buy something, it's got to sell through, it's got to work, it's got to be a compelling enough idea, compelling enough story, and the wine eventually has to taste good enough to those people that receive it that they want to come back and buy it again. And I think that those are the two things. So there's John saying to me, I back you, I got you, but don't cock it up. And then there's the second side of it, which when you offer the wines and you tell the story to customers, and they respond to that, they go, I love that. I love the way you've presented that. I love the way you've told that story. I want some of that. I mean, there's nothing more gratifying, satisfying, whatever, than to feel vindicated is the wrong word, but to feel that sense of endorsement, that you feel like you've gone out there, you've done the work, you've turned over all those stones, and you found something that you believe in, to then present it to the public. I mean, it's to our client base, and for them to go, I like that, Simon, I like what you've done there, I'll have some of that. That's a great thing. That's so encouraging. And I would say, when I joined A&B in 2012, it was very much the John Arnold club. Everyone knew John, who was in the bit. All the customers were sort of fans of John, right? They backed John, and so when somebody new came into the business, that i.e. me, it wasn't a gimme that they would back me as well, and yet they did. And it's something, you know in terms of that support, and mentorship is the wrong word, but that support and that endorsement, I've never forgotten being sort of taken on by the A&B clientele, and them saying, I'll give you a chance, I'll buy some wine from you, and I'll see whether I like it. And yeah, that was a big moment. Those first wines that I found, some of them quite unknown producers, um and the A&B clientele taking a chance on them. That was a big thing.
So you talked earlier about how your taste had gone towards sort of smaller, more artisanal, handmade, and you also talked about, obviously you talked about kind of sort of lesser known. So tell me about finding those, and about seeking them out. You mentioned turning over stones. It feels very familiar. It's what I do on a different on a personal basis rather than on a wine basis. But I'm curious about finding those, and finding stories that will appeal to you and to the customers.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I remember us being, John and I being in Piedmont on one trip, and we spent the whole day tasting. I mean, I would tend generally to make appointments with wineries that sounded interesting. Maybe wineries that were just starting up that I'd heard about, or wineries that had maybe had some critical attention, or perhaps they had a patch of land that I was interested in. I mean, that's one thing that we've always stressed at A&B, is that idea of following the land. Finding really, really nice parcels of land that maybe are farmed by somebody that hasn't yet had the limelight shone on them, or maybe it's just starting out, that kind of thing. And we sort of got to the very end of the day. We probably had, I don't know, five or six appointments, something like that. And we had one appointment left. I remember John saying to me, "Ooh, not sure I can be bothered. Why don't we just drive back up to Turin Airport and we'll go home?" And I said, "No, come on, we'll go to the final appointment of the day." And it was this young guy. So this would have been his first vintage, 2009 was his first vintage, guy called Matteo Elena, in a less slightly less famous corner of La Mora. You know, La Mora is this big starry, it's the biggest commune in Barolo. It's got all these famous names, you know, Roberto Fuerzio is the king and all that sort of stuff. But meeting Matteo Elena was a real eye opener. He was making wines. It was, like I said, first vintage, 2009. He was making wines in a very traditional way, even though he'd been working at Elio Altare before. So he'd come from that sort of new Barolo, squeaky clean, extracted, you know, oak type thing previously. But he instinctively gone in another direction. And still remember tasting his 2009 Barolo Ascari and thinking, yeah, now we found something. I remember looking at John looking at me, and then I you know, sort of, you know, an exchange of eyebrows kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, it was that. It was turning up and putting in the work, and, you know, making appointments, tasting the range, thanking them very sincerely, and, you know, moving on to the next one. And we did that again and again and again and again until we found things that we really liked.
How do you say no to someone you like who is making wine you don't like?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons to say no to somebody. I mean, sometimes the economics of it simply don't work. You know, sometimes it's just a case that the winemaker wants too much money for the thing, which within your portfolio, within your offering, or within your ethos or whatever, just doesn't work. It would look too much like an outlier. And in there, I mean, I've found, generally speaking, just being honest most of the time works. You know, just thanking them for their time, um, and just saying, you know, it feels to me like, you know, the style of wines that you're working in and the style of wines that I'm interested in aren't necessarily aligned. And, you know, it was, you know, great to meet you. Stay in touch, maybe, but, we'll both move on. I think being straightforward and honest and communicating in business is always a good idea. You know, be it, you know, I've always thought that in customer interactions. You know, there are people who, you know, when a problem arises, you know, that the wrong wine gets delivered or doesn't get delivered at all, or it's broken, or whatever it is, you know, I think there's someone's an instinct, as you know, to hide under the rock and not you know, not come clean. But actually, most people are pretty reasonable. And you know, if you admit to somebody that there's been a mistake or that something went wrong, most people are a bit like, I mean, it is only wine at the end of the day. You know, we're not dealing in you know, live organ or whatever. You know, we're not dealing anything that really has any sort of life or death thing. And so being honest and just saying to them, you know, really nice, thanks for your time. You've got some nice land there, but it's not one for us, you know, and you move on. I would say that as well, that as my sort of travel through this career has gone on, the hit rates and the miss rates have got, you know, they've become a different ratio, because a lot now of the people that I work with tend to have come from recommendations for people who either work in the industry or make wine themselves, or they're people who had worked at the places that I already work with. So you create this sort of, you know, spider web of contacts. So the misses now tend to be for very, very specific reasons, rather than I don't like the wine. I mean, I tend to like most of the wine I taste, because most of the wine I taste comes from people I either know or trust, or have worked with people I know and trust. So the misses tend to be for other reasons.
One of the things you mentioned as you were kind of getting started and presenting these wines to your clients was them appreciating the story. So I'm curious about story in wine. Obviously, such an important thing. What are the stories that resonate with you and resonate with the people you're selling wine to?
The story is everything. I say this all the time. There's tons of great wine being made around the world, or at least tons of competent wine being made around the world. You know, there's wine which you know, I like a specific style of wine, but I'm I'm totally happy to accept there's wine being made all over the place, which is perfectly decent, perfectly drinkable, all that sort of stuff. The interesting thing is the story. The interesting thing is the people, and the interesting thing is the land. And the knack is really is to combine that story into a thing. It could be that the story that you tell the clients almost has nothing to do with the wine at all. I mean, it could just be the fact that you got bitten by the bloke's dog when you went to taste the wine. Because a lot of our customers are people that do stressful, busy, high-powered jobs. They're lawyers, they're bankers, they're whatever they might be, and they spend a lot of their time in meetings, sitting at desks, making decisions about all kinds of way more important things than what wine to drink. And so when you present to them a story that transports them, it could be about the fact that you're writing this as you're walking up a rocky hillside, or I've written offers in all kinds of weird places because the moment has just struck me. I remember once writing an offer sitting on an airplane whilst being struck by lightning, and it was one of the best offers I ever wrote. I think it went incredibly well, and customers, it resonated with customers. And I think finding those stories and finding those characters, and some characters are just endlessly writable about. In fact, I've just come off the phone before I was talking to you. I was chatting to Jim Marsh from Arterbury Marsh, one of the great characters from one of the great, the great family businesses in the Oregon wine trade. And Jim Marsh is endlessly quotable. He's a fantastically eloquent man. I mean, his wines are off the chart. But he's a brilliantly articulate man who's able to distill the idea of a wine or a vintage down into a really pithy, quotable way of describing them. And I think that's the thing we try and do as much as possible. We try not to get in the way of the stories too much. Often when you read, not to criticize my comrades in the London wine trade, but sometimes you read these offers that read a bit like either Dear Diary, or they read a bit like they read just incredibly formulaic. It's like they're written by rote. And I think letting the winemaker tell the story as best that they can, either of the vintage or of the wine or of the land or of whatever it might be, I think is a way more interesting thing. I have a bugbear, which is that so many offers start off with "We are delighted to offer," and I really don't care how delighted you are. I could not care less. I think what's interesting is when you get yourself out of the way and present the thing. What is the thing? What's the story? I mean, if the most interesting thing you've got to write is how pleased you are about what you're doing, you've probably missed the entire point of the thing. Actually, what's much more interesting is the fantastic seafood that Jim Marsh cooked me the other week. Boy, he can cook as well. He can cook, he can make wine, that guy can do everything. That's way more interesting, right? Than some story about how pleased you are because you're offering some wine. Get out of the way. Let the winemaker or let the land tell the story. I think that's much more interesting.
It seems like a good time to ask about Oregon and when Oregon became part of your life. So tell me about your initial introduction to Oregon and what your initial impressions were.
Yeah, so kind of with reference to what I said earlier about John telling me that I could buy whatever I want as long as it didn't come from any of the regions that he was working in, I decided that I had to go and find something that did the things that his regions did, but did it better. And I mean, the thing that sells for us as a business is Pinot and Chardonnay. So Pinot and Chardonnay is about 85% of everything we sell. Be that Burgundy, be it Oregon, be it Champagne, Pinot and Chardonnay just sells. It's a thing that really works with our customers. And so John and I were chatting about what other regions do the thing that the Burgundy does, right? So we were already doing Northern Italy. We've done a little bit in Central Italy with Chianti. We were starting to work with some really beautiful, interesting producers there. But neither Nebbiolo or Sangiovese are Pinot Noir. They're not Chardonnay. So I started looking around, and I looked at all the sort of usual places. I looked at South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, California, all these kind of places. And at the time, the writer Neil Martin was working for Robert Parker, and he had just written an article about Oregon, about the Willamette Valley. And I read it, and I thought, this sounds interesting. I'd sort of never, I guess I knew that Oregon existed. Well, I did know that Oregon existed because Jean-Marie Fourier, who we worked with in Burgundy, had been at Domaine Drouin in the late 90s, and at two of our producers in Burgundy, Pierre-Yves Colin Moret and Domaine Dancer. They both had Doug Turnell from Brickhouse come and visit. So there were these little sort of micro connections there. So I kind of knew that the Willamette Valley existed. I didn't know it was called the Willamette Valley. I mean, I knew it was sort of Oregon, right? But, you know, and so I read Neil's article and I thought, okay, sounds interesting. And then I started reading some stuff that Josh Reynolds was writing for Vintners, and I thought, okay, there's some stuff here. So I looked at kind of their pick of the pops and sent some emails and got a really nice response. And I managed to get some samples, and we got them sent to London. And John and I sat and had lunch one day in a lovely restaurant in Chelsea called Medlar, and they've got these sort of booths there, so you sort of a little sort of private sort of section. We sat in one of these booths one lunchtime with this huge pile of samples from all across Oregon. Not all across Oregon, all from the Willamette Valley, but from a whole raft of different producers. And we tasted our way through them. It was sort of a blind tasting, right? Because although we could see the labels, they meant nothing to us. You know, we didn't know what Marsh was, we didn't know what Bethel Heights was, we didn't know what Trisatum was, we didn't know what any of this stuff was. And at the end of lunch, we had three piles of wine. We had a pile of no's, we had a pile of maybes, but we had a pile of yeses. And we thought, okay, there's something here. And so I got in touch with Neil Martin, and we had dinner together, and he very kindly sort of gave me a bit of a brain dump about what the region is and what it's all about. And, he talked to me about the difference between Dundee and Ribbon Ridge and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, I basically said, "Do you think there's something there?" And he said, "No, there's definitely something there." He said, "You want to get out there and have a look?" So again, I'm super grateful to Neil for giving up an evening. I did bring a nice bottle of Merceau Charme from PYCM, so he got something out of it as well. But no, I mean, Neil was very kind, very generous, and gave me his time, and we bought plane tickets. And that was August 2015. We flew to Seattle, and we spent a night in Seattle. And then we got the train. And of course, no one gets the train, do they? We got the train down from Seattle to Portland. And we stayed down at the Allison, and we had, I forget how long, 5 nights, 4 nights, something like that in the Allison. And we went and visited all those people that were in the yes pile. And yeah, I mean, by the end of it, we were absolutely smitten. By the end of it, we'd agreed that we were going to work with Brickhouse, with Ashbury Marsh, with Patricia Green, with Trisatum, with Shea, with Domaine Roy. I'm sure there's others, and any of my producers that watch this and say you forgot about me. But we came back actually with a really, I mean, and what a bunch of guys as well, and gals. I mean, just wonderful people who they were sort of everything I was looking for. This amazing undiscovered from an Englishman's point of view, this undiscovered wine region making wines that were fantastic. There's this sort of story in wine, about these kind of pioneering wine merchants, people from your country like Kermit Lynch, and people from our side like Anthony Sargent and Roy Richards and these kind of people who went to these places when they were starting, domain bottling and that kind of stuff, and picked up all these amazing producers, going out in the days when you could just go out and meet Dujac and Roumier and all these kind of things and sign them, right? And we'd found that. was the weirdest thing. I mean, I remember chatting to Jim Anderson at Paddy Green, and him. They threw a little party for us, and Michael Etzel came, and Marcus Goodfellow came, and Kelly Fox came, and we were just chatting to these people, and I was thinking, God, this. And none of them really had any experience with dealing with anybody outside of the US. They were selling to distributors in the US, and they were selling direct to consumer in the Northwest. But none of them had ever sold really any wine to the UK, and so we were these sort of, yeah, these kind of these Venice explorers. It was a, still one of, that 2015 trip, and it gets repeated in some way every year when I come to the Willamette Valley. But it feels like such an enormous privilege to have found this region full of these incredible characters with this incredible land. And what a climate. I mean, it's heaven on earth for growing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. I mean, it's just, the challenges that our friends in Burgundy face, they do not face, you do not face in the Willamette Valley. It is the most fantastic place. And it's still, unexplored, still largely unplanted. And, I remember saying to somebody or other, what do you think the best vineyard is in the Willamette Valley? And them saying, not sure it's been planted yet. What an amazing place. So that was the start of it. So we came out in 2015, and we came back in the end of August. I went off on holiday with my family. John, who couldn't, it was absolutely itching to do something, did an offer of Brick House, and it sold. Customers, the loyal, wonderful A&B clientele backed us and said, we'll do that. We'll take some of that on. We'll trust you, John, Simon. We'll do that. And it grew from there. So after that, so these were the other thing I would say is that we were coming and we were tasting 2013s largely. And of course, 2013 is seen, I think, in the US as being a bit of a rubbish vintage. It rained. Boy, did it rain at harvest time. And yet, of course, we didn't really know any of this. And we would show up at these wineries, and we were tasting these beautiful, ethereal, red-fruited, delicate, gorgeous Pinots. And we were going, oh my God, this is amazing. This actually exists somewhere, and no one knows anything about it. What a place. And of course, the wine producers were going, yeah, 13's great. Yeah, please, come in. But the funny thing is that we found what we were looking for, which was maybe something different from what the US consumer at the time was looking for. So it kind of suited everybody, it really suited everybody. And yeah, we fell in love with the wine, we fell in love with the place, and we fell in love with the people. And every time I come back, it's just, it's more of the same.
It's a pretty incredible origin story. I love that. Tell me about, so you come back regularly and you're building relationships. What have you seen in the 10 years you've been around Oregon wine? What is the evolution? What is the growth? And who have you sort of seen come on the scene since you started?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's been a pretty incredible 10 years, 11, I guess 11 years now. I think when we first came, I would say 11 years ago, we felt like we were much closer, probably from a timeline point of view, to the beginning of the Oregon thing than we feel now. It feels like there's been a real change. I think a lot of that money that's come into the Willamette Valley from, particularly from France, from Burgundy, but from other places as well, big money, Constellation money, Artemis money, big money coming into the region, I think has been, I mean, I think the sort of, the niche indie kid in me thinks that it's a bad thing, but it isn't really. It's a good thing. It's exactly what we are. It's people from somewhere else recognizing the brilliance of the Willamette Valley and wanting to invest in it, which is only what we're doing, And I think the beauty of the Willamette Valley is that there is still room for the new, and there's still room for the wonderful characters. And there's still room to do stuff there. I mean, if we talk about new stuff, we recently picked up the white walnut wines from Chris Mays Pink. essentially a piece of dirt on the edge of the Dundee Hills, which was covered in brambles and Chris took it on himself. He cleared it himself. He's planted it with the most incredible selection of clonal material, to the point where the idea, and I mean, if we want to get boring about clones, I mean, that was the one story that we had a lot when we first arrived in Oregon, was this story of, Pomar, Wadensville, Corey, Wente, Draper. It's not very interesting. When you come from Europe, the clones are just not a story. The land is the story, and I think that's been one of the things that we've tried to do wherever possible, is to blur that focus of the clonal story and turn it much more into a story of the people and the land. And with the way that vineyards are being planted now, be it white walnut, which I think is one of the creme de la creme vineyards and winemakers in the Willamette Valley. I think what Chris is doing there is, absolute dynamite. He's a great guy. He's making beautiful, pure, transparent wines, and he's doing it on a really unique, really cool patch of land. So that, it's like tick, tick, tick. It's like everything you want when you're me and you're traveling, whatever it is, 10,000 miles to come and taste wine. And and I think that's what's so cool about Oregon now and still, is that still exists, that still is a possibility, that that can still happen. And there's still room for all the old characters. Doug Turnell is still making incredible wine at Brickhouse, and he's whatever he is, mid-70s. And Mike Etzel is still a cantankerous old whatchamacallit down at Sequitur, still making great wine, still getting, still with all of the energy and all of the enthusiasm and all of the love for the people and the region and the wines that he makes. So there's the older guard are still making these incredible wines, but there's also this newer community coming through, some of whom are proteges of those people. So people like, just before the conversation, you said that the first image you found of me on the internet was me hugging Grant Coulter at 100 Suns. And Grant, of course, was years and years at Beaufrere, working under Mike. And so, and that's how we often go about meeting these characters, is because there is something so wonderful and collegiate and connected about the Oregon wine scene. So that, on that first trip when we signed, Brickhouse, Artbury Marsh, Tresaton, Bethel Heights, Patty Green, etc., all of those people have introduced us to other people. So at the time, the guy who was Jimmy Marsh's sales rep was a young skateboarding kid called Seth Morgan Long. And who is Seth Morgan Long? He's the guy making the best Chardonnay in the Willamette Valley now. And it's these little threads, these little connections. The first night we went to see Jim Anderson, he threw a party and introduced us to Mike Etzel and Marcus Goodfellow. I mean, wow, imagine meeting someone like Marcus Goodfellow. I mean, one of the most talented, amazing winemakers probably on the planet. And he's just there at this party, this bring a dish party. Everyone brought some couscous salad and some, I mean, it just doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. What a place,
That's so amazing. That's so amazing to hear that. I love that. I'm curious, you mentioned for a lot of the people you were meeting, or maybe all the people you were meeting, this was sort of their first time selling internationally, first time selling in the UK. So I assume that means that the UK market wasn't very educated on it either, and they were sort of, like you said, sort of taking a chance on you, on your say so.
Yeah.
How has that developed in a decade? How is sort of the Oregon wine brand in the United Kingdom?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really speak for Oregon or the Oregon market in the UK generally, because I mean, I occupy a small niche of it. And we deliberately keep ourselves not exactly separate from the rest of the UK wine trade, but we do our thing, and we concentrate on what we're up to. But I can say from an internal point of view that since 2015, when Oregon was 0 on our balance sheet, it's now the second most important region we deal with. So we sell more Oregon in whatever metric you want to do that, bottles, customers, turnover, whatever, however you want to measure it. We do more in Oregon than we do in any other region other than Burgundy. How about that? I mean, how about that as an endorsement of what the possibilities are for this incredible region. And it's grown, it's grown from, five producers, or one producer if you start with Brickhouse, but five producers, and we now work with 20, 25 different producers. And if and I'm sure we can go on and talk about it, but if market conditions were more favorable, I could be easily hoovering up more producers, because there's so much great stuff being made in the Willamette Valley. There's so many possibilities, so many intelligent people with brilliant ideas. And that's my experience of the Oregon or the Willamette wine scene, is so many brilliant, clever people, full of ideas, creative, bright people who just want to take a patch of land and turn it into something remarkable, and hope they find a market for it.
Well, before we talk about this particular moment in time, which I'm very curious to talk about, putting that aside for a moment and assuming some level of sanity, tell me about what you see in the future for Oregon wine, for not only for the industry here, but also for your relationship with it.
Yeah, I think we've been very fortunate in discovering the Willamette Valley when we did, because it meant that we could largely have our pick of the top producers. And I consider myself and A&B to be incredibly fortunate to have been able to put together the roster of producers that we have put together. It's a real sort of, this is no credit to me at all. This is entirely because they've individually introduced their friends to me, and because of the backing of the A&B clientele, it means that we've been able to take these additional producers on. So it's, I feel, it's sort of pinch me when I look at our portfolio. We've got, from all of the greats, I would say, and lots of really exciting young producers. So to have the likes of White Walnut and Morgan Long sitting alongside people like Thomas and Sequitur and Brickhouse and Patty Green and Bethel Heights, and I mean, it's just, wow. Imagine having that same portfolio of producers in Burgundy. I mean, it would be DRC, Roumier, Rousseau, de Vogüé, Koch, Ramonet. It'd be that. It would be that, and that's what we've been able to assemble in the Willamette Valley, but by fortunate timing and because of the belief that our customers have had. So I think in a sense that we have that privilege, that we've got these super producers. So I think that gives us the possibility to weather, to an extent, economic storms. I think because the wines are that good, and the producers are that good, and the stories surrounding those producers are that good. Of course, nothing is immune to everything, right? And our job is to remain as positive as possible, and keep telling the stories, and keep reinforcing the idea that these wines are like nothing else on the planet. I mean, you may have seen me taking a few sips from the glass in front of me. That's the freshly bottled 2023 Marsh Vineyard from Artbury Marsh, 12.9%, with rapier acidity, incredibly lush, beautiful fruit. I mean, that thing can't really exist anywhere else in the world. You can't make a wine that's that ripe, that has that level of acidity, and has that low alcohol anywhere else. I mean, what an amazing place. I wrote it down. Jimmy harvested it on what did he say? Like the 15th of October or something. 15th of October in 2023 was a month after they'd finished harvesting in Burgundy. A whole month. And he's like, yeah, I think I'll go and harvest now. What an amazing place. How amazing is that? And it's 12.9%. And I think that's the point. When you have stuff like this, when you have stuff like Jimmy's Marsh Vineyard Chardonnay, or you have John Thomas's unbelievably delicious 2023 coming down the pipe, and I mean, I could name all of the wines I work with, right, because they're all incredible. I think it gives customers the choice and the opportunity to buy wines which are very, very, very fairly priced. We always say that one of the beauties of Oregon is, well, one of the many beauties is the fact that these wines are approachable and they are affordable. and that you can have Premier Cru quality at Village Burgundy prices. And that's the kicker, that's the seller, that's the thing, because the wines are brilliant. They are single vineyard Pinot and Chardonnays made to a hugely high degree of skill and competency and deliciousness. You can drink them young, you can drink them old. Yeah, they're marvelous. So I think that gives us somehow a kind of security in the region, because we've got this great roster of producers. But I think there are challenges that face the Oregon wine industry. Certainly, I think there's a lot of wine being produced at the moment. I think it's sort of boom time in the Willamette Valley, and I think there's a lot of land being planted, and I think there'll be a shaking out over time of which parcels of land truly merit to be worthy. I think you see it around harvest time, particularly when there's been a decent crop. I mean, there's grapes available. It's not all sewn up over there, and I think there's a danger of, maybe the word overproduction is too strong a word. And again, we're working with a very small niche layer of producers. We don't work with the Willamette Valley. We work with 20 small producers who happen to farm in the Willamette Valley. So we look at things slightly differently, but. Yeah, I think that's maybe the only real challenge. I mean, I think all the rest of it, the money coming in, the challenges of climate change, all the rest of it, I think are mostly positive for the Willamette Valley. I think, but I think there's a period now where people need to work out, do I really need to plant that vineyard? Is it essential? Is there a market for the grapes that I'm going to produce from it? But like I said, they're bright, switched on, creative people, and they'll figure this stuff out, I'm sure.
So obviously, an interesting time in history right now, with especially international economics. Before we talk about that, I want to talk about sort of alcohol and wine market in general. With obviously a lot of challenges for selling alcohol right now. I'm curious how you've seen that play out from your side. And sort of what the challenges and sort of strategies are for you right now.
I think it's quite hard to separate the story which is being told. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing with it as a truth or whatever, but the story that we're being told about this idea that the generation that are coming through now are not drinking as much as the generations that preceded. I suspect it's true, but I also think that there is an aspect with fine wine which is based upon size of bank balance. An average bottle for us to sell is about £40 a bottle. When you add in the taxes that go on top of that, it's about £50 a bottle. I mean, we sell a spectrum of wines. We sell everything from 15 to £20 a bottle up to 150, £200 a bottle. But that middle piece, that sweet spot, 35 to 50, that sort of price is kind of where we deal. And if you're a young person living in London and struggling to buy a house, and juggling with the economic realities that everyone's dealing with post-COVID, maybe wine is not necessarily at the top of your priority list in the way that it might have been for the partner at the law firm or whatever that person happens to be 5-10 years previously. And I think that degree of uncertainty means that people maybe dial back their discretionary income. Or we haven't seen it too much. We've seen it a bit. We definitely see a slight changing of the guard where customers are potentially more interested in trying a broader range of wines, but buying less in terms of volume. So their overall spend is it's kind of roughly where the spend of a client would have been previously, but they tend to want to spread that spend more thinly and try more things. So that's the sort of challenge that we need to respond to. Where in the past we were selling mostly whole cases of wine, I think there is a reality that people like to try a wider selection. So we're selling things in, in threes, let's say, rather than sixes or 12s. And I think that in a way is part of what makes, us as a business, plausible and successful, is that we're very nimble. We're a very small business, and we can just do that kind of stuff. We can make choices like, okay, well, we're just going to do that because that's what the customer wants us to do, and we'll be led by that, and we'll believe that, and that's absolutely fine. And we're quite agnostic, really, in terms of in terms of what we sell. We believe in the producers we work with, but if somebody would rather have three of this and three of this and three of this and three of that to make a 12 bottle case rather than just 12 of that, I mean, I'm happy. That's okay. I mean, I don't mind that at all. That's just something that for us to figure out from a tech point of view and from a warehousing point of view. And again, that could potentially be an area in the wine trade which is maybe a little bit left behind. But one of the things that we've done, right from the start, is invest in technology. And so we've always built our own systems. We've always spent a lot of time figuring out how to do warehousing in a way which is sympathetic to the wine and commercially sensible and precise. I mean, I think precision in warehousing, maybe 10 years ago, it kind of didn't matter, and there were things like mispicks and the wrong wine got sent out and whoops, sorry, But when you see how successful these businesses like Amazon and stuff, I mean, I don't know about you, I've never had a mispick from Amazon. They just get it right every time, and that's the standard. Actually, that's just where you have to be now. You have to be that good, and that's where we want to be. We don't want to be Amazon, but we want to be that good. We don't benchmark ourselves against what the wine trade was previously. We want to be doing something which is precise and tech driven and using whatever the latest thing is in order to make us from an importing and distribution point of view work well, but also from a customer service point of view. How do we make our customers' lives easier? How do we make their interactions with us easier? And tech is so fantastic at doing that. When you do it and hopefully we do this, we do it in a human way.
Of course, the other challenge of the moment is the tariffs going on right now. I'm curious how that is affecting what you're doing over the past couple of months. And again, sort of strategies for dealing with it and long-term outlook. I guess
Yeah,
short,
I mean,
short and long-term outlook.
yeah, okay. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, at the moment, tariffs do not affect us at all because there are no tariffs. So as of, I haven't looked at the news since you and I have been chatting, but as of 4 p.m. this afternoon, the UK government has not put any tariffs on US goods or US wine. So from a purely from that point of view, we're okay at the moment. I think one of the challenges, and we have seen this a little bit, is there is a degree, I'm hoping it's not widespread, but there is a degree of anti-US sentiment around. There is a degree of people saying, I'm not buying anything from those guys. I don't like it. I don't like the thing they're doing. We have a lot of guys who work for US law firms. Well, the way that the US administration is currently choosing my words carefully, operating and behaving towards some of these law firms because they may be deemed to be on the wrong side of whatever. I mean, that's uncomfortable. That's an uncomfortable thing. And we don't get involved in politics, but a lot of our customers will work for these firms or firms that are adjacent to these firms, and so they feel it and they know it and they recognize it. And of course, the stock market turmoil doesn't help. A lot of our customers work either in or adjacent to the financial services industry, and when the stock market and equities and everything are a roller coaster, that's what they're focusing on, and they're not focusing necessarily on what the next release from wherever is all about. So I think that's the challenge a little bit. I mean, there's the stuff we can manage and the stuff that we can't manage. We can manage things like foreign exchange, so we can protect ourselves to an extent. Clearly, that's a short to medium term thing. You can't stockpile currency forever, but if only. But you can mitigate some of the roller coaster in FX to an extent. So you can be very careful there, which we are and which we have been. And I think you can just continue to try and tell the story in as compelling and meaningful a way as possible. I mean, the story is still compelling, and we have found over the course of the last 6 months or so that we have to gently and politely get in front of customers about the same thing several times in order to catch their attention. And the upshot generally is that, year on year, we're where we were this time last year, and last year was a good year for us. And so we believe that if we keep doing what we've been doing, maybe with a little bit more refinement in terms of telling the story, maybe in a little bit more refinement in terms of the channels of communication, we will continue to see the success that the wines that we represent deserve. I mean, that's all it is, right? We're just trying to do as good a job as we can for the people whose wines we love and believe in, and that's what we're going to keep trying to do. And so far, so good. But with every passing day and with every passing news cycle, it seems to get more what's the word? Interesting. And let's hope some of that interesting stuff dissipates over the summer.
Yes, boring sounds good right now, I would say.
I take
Let's talk a little bit about you and what's next for you. Anything on your horizon, personally or professionally, that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that the growth of the business over the last few years has allowed us to do is, as well as kind of investing in newer, younger, more interesting, not more interesting, but younger, interesting winemakers in the regions we cover. And it's probably worth saying that, A&B Vintners is not and does not aim to cover every wine region. We effectively do Burgundy, the Rhone Valley, Provence, Northern Italy, Champagne, and the Willamette Valley, with little tiny skirmishes in places like the Mosel and the Wachau and those kind of places. But and we like that. We like the fact that we're not a one-stop shop, like some of our contemporaries in London are, and we like the idea that we attempt to do a small number of things well rather than doing a load of things less well. And that model has been really successful over the last 10 years, and that's allowed us to invest in a kind of a new generation of talented wine merchants coming through our ranks. So we've hired three people in the last 12, 18 months, young people with a background in the industry, talented, intelligent, creative people like the winemakers we go out looking for. And it's very, very cool watching their ideas and watching them, challenge us. I hate to say it, the slightly older generation in the business, giving us a little poke and saying, well, how about doing this? How about doing it this way? Because young people in the business, just like young winemakers, in our portfolio, challenge us and make us think again and reevaluate what's important and what works and all that sort of stuff. So that's hugely exciting for us as a business, to be able, especially in a difficult market, to invest in young people and to hopefully allow them to succeed in the way that we've been able to.
Really exciting to hear. I like that. Like you say, always sort of pushing and being pushed. It's good for business.
Yeah. Oh, it really is good for business. It's really good for business, and it's good for. I think it's good for our client base, which again, our client base has evolved a lot over, certainly since post-COVID. The client base has evolved. There's younger people coming into the business who are, sort of newly in positions where they earn a few quid and they can afford to buy, fine wine. And yeah, it's great. When we host dinners and events and tastings and that kind of stuff, it's great to see the number of, once upon a time I was the youngest guy in the room. And now very often I'm the oldest guy in the room, and that's fantastic. That shows that the thing works, and the idea of telling these stories and working with these creative, dynamic, interesting winemakers is as relevant now as it was when I started out 25 years ago. I think telling those stories is absolutely vital, and as long as it keeps drawing in the new people, from a client point of view, and drawing in new people from the winemaking point of view, and drawing in new colleagues, you know, who can liven us up and shake things up within the firm. I think that's really cool as well.
You've come a long way for a van driver's mate, I have to say. That's pretty impressive.
Thank you.
Last question I have for you. Tell me about an unforgettable bottle of wine you've had, whether it was the wine, whether it was the occasion, the experience. Tell me about an unforgettable wine you've had.
There's a few. Does it matter if it's not from Oregon? I could do one from Oregon.
Doesn't matter at all.
Well, okay, I'll tell you the story. So, John and I were at dinner in the village of Savigny-les-Bains in Burgundy with our dear friends, the Guillemot family, long-term winemakers that we've worked with. They make beautiful, soulful, wonderful wines. Mostly from Savigny, a little bit of Corton. And one of the great things about the Guillemot family is that they have deep stocks of old wines. They don't sell them, but when you are fortunate enough to spend time there, they often bring these bottles out. You know, bottles from the 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, they pull these wonderful old bottles out. And although Savigny-le-Bains maybe doesn't have the reputation of, you know, some of the big names in the Côte d'Huez, actually their wines age beautifully. I mean, they can age incredibly well. And so we were fortunate that they invited us for dinner one night, and we'd had a wonderful meal of chicken, and they brought some older vintages. We had some 1960s, 1966, I think it was, Savigny-les-Bains, Serpentier, and maybe one or two other things. And it was a terrific night. Probably we drunk more than we should have done. There was lots of noise around the table. It was a fabulous night, and a night just without this sort of final piece, which would have been memorable on its own. So it was a lovely evening spent with lovely people, and their lovely wines. And at the end, Pierre, the father, says, "I'm going to go downstairs. I'm sure I've got a bottle of Sauterne somewhere." And he returns with this old bottle. And no labels, nothing on it, just an old bottle of, you know, golden or almost sort of caramel colored wine. Anyway, he pulls the cork out. It comes out in about 3,000 pieces. It's a total mess. And I say to Pierre, "So what's the story, Pierre? What's all this about then?" He said, "My grandfather worked as a negociant. And in those days, what that meant was that he would go around and he would buy barrels of wine, and then he would bring them back to Savigny-les-Bains, and then he would bottle them and he would sell these bottles locally." He said, "I don't really know what the story is of this one. It's a Sauterne. So I assume that at some point he would have gone to Bordeaux and he would have bought a barrel and brought it back and bottled it and sold it around here." Okay. So anyway, he pours this amazing color, this sort of amber colored liquid into all our glasses, and we start drinking. And it's fantastic, beautiful shape, you know, delicious, sweet barley sugar Sauterne. And I start picking up all these little bits of cork around the table, and I managed to compress them back into the original cork. And I could read it because the name of the chateau had been stamped on the cork. And I said to Pierre, "Do you know what it is?" He said, "No idea." He said, "It's the last bottle I've got. I wanted to share it with you." I said, "It's 1918 Rieseg." And he was like, and the whole table sort of went quiet. I said, "Do you know what the story is? I mean, the state of France in 1918, how did this even happen? How did this wine get made? How did it get transported?" Because presumably it would have been transported, you know, it would have been made, put into barrel, and then I'm guessing shipped quite early. I mean, 1919. I mean, you know, France was a disaster zone in that time. Don't forget as well, you know, after the First World War, there was also the Spanish flu that breezed through and killed almost as many people as the war did. And you know, Europe was a catastrophe. And yet this wine, somehow this incredible wine, had survived from a barrel in Bordeaux, crossed all the way to eastern France, to Savigny-les-Bains, and had been bottled by Pierre. So we were tears rolling down our cheeks by this point, you know, around the table because of what, you know, the fact that he'd chosen to share this last bottle with us, the fact that he didn't really know what it was, and then what it had turned out to be. Uh, yeah, it was a magical moment actually. It was a emotional and yeah, very meaningful thing just around an old bottle of wine that he found in the corner of his cellar, you know. But it when you have an experience like that where wine takes on real meaning from his family's point of view, but also from the history of our continent and the world, I guess. I mean, you know, the First World War was significant across the planet, and you know, to have something that you know somehow managed to survive was a real thing. Actually, was a real thing. Is that all right?
That's
Does that work?
that's a pretty good story. That's I think that's the magical thing, right? That's what it is about wine, right? It's like that it is that time and place, and there is that chance of sort of history on your shelf and history in your glass that is
Yeah,
so magical. Yeah, that's incredible.
yeah.
Uh, that's all the questions that I have for you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything we didn't cover here today that you wanted to cover?
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, I just, you know, like I said, yesterday when I looked at that you interviewed my good buddy John Thomas, the idea that I might be, you know, somehow in the same pantheon as him in your archive, I'm really touched by. So I'm grateful that you've let me come on and tell a few stories.
Thank you so much. We are so grateful as well. And it's especially nice. One of the great things about wine and the archive is that even though we are focused on Oregon, it's so nice to get an outside perspective, not just on wine in general, but on Oregon. It's easy to be inside the bubble. And so we appreciate kind of a view from outside the bubble from time to time. And it's also nice to be reminded that you live in a magical place, that other people find it that way as well. So I'm glad you have discovered it and enjoyed it. So
That's good.
thank you so much, and we really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks very much for inviting me on.